The ballroom at Ashford House had never held so much silence. Duke Ashford stood at the center of it, surrounded by 3 foreign envoys in fine dark coats, their faces unreadable, their patience visibly thinning. Behind him, his 4th translator in as many days packed his satchel with trembling hands and refused to meet his eyes. "I cannot help you, Your Grace," the man muttered. "The terms are beyond me. I must go." The door shut. The silence returned, heavier now. Ashford's jaw tightened. 6 months of negotiation, an entire fortune staked on this single trade agreement, and he could not so much as greet these men properly. The envoys exchanged a glance, the kind that meant they were already calculating how quickly they could leave Bristol and take their contracts elsewhere. "Perhaps," said the eldest envoy, in halting English, "we return another season." It was not a question. It was a door closing. Ashford felt the weight of every debt, every promise, every hope he'd built this deal upon collapsing in real time. He opened his mouth, uncertain what to say, when a voice, quiet, unhurried, entirely unexpected, spoke from the doorway. It was not English. It was fluent, warm, effortless French, addressed directly to the envoys, apologizing for the delay and asking, with perfect courtesy, whether they might continue in comfort. Every head turned. There, half forgotten in the corner where she'd been arranging correspondence no one thought to notice, stood Lady Whitmore, the librarian's daughter. The Spinster Society had long since stopped inviting to anything that mattered. The envoys stared. Ashford stared. She did not blush. She did not falter. She simply switched, without pause, into Italian. Nobody moved for a long moment. Then the eldest envoy laughed, a genuine, startled sound, and answered her in kind. Duke Ashford felt something shift in his chest that he could not immediately name. Relief, certainly. But also something sharper, more uncomfortable, the recognition that he had walked past this woman in his own household for the better part of a fortnight and never once considered she might be capable of anything beyond cataloguing books. "You speak Italian," he said, when the envoys had been settled with tea and the immediate crisis had passed. It was not quite a question. "And French, Your Grace." "Spanish, and enough Portuguese to be useful, though I confess my accent wants practice." Lady Whitmore folded her hands before her, unbothered by his astonishment. "My father was a translator himself, before his death. He believed a mind left idle was a mind wasted, regardless of what society expected a woman to do with it. And yet no one thought to mention this. No one asked. There was no bitterness in it, only fact, and somehow that was worse. Ashford had spent 3 days in a state of near panic, had nearly lost the single most important contract of his career, while the solution sat quietly in his own library, unremarked upon because she was unmarried, unfashionable, and past the age society considered a woman worth noticing. He said nothing further that evening, but he watched her work. Watched the envoys warm to her, watched her navigate not merely the words but the delicate diplomacy beneath them, softening a blunt phrase here, clarifying an insult that was never intended there. She was, he realized with something like shame, extraordinary. Word spread quickly through Bristol's drawing rooms, as word always did. The overlooked Lady Whitmore, suddenly indispensable to the Duke's negotiations. Some called it charming. Others called it unseemly, a woman conducting business among men, speaking languages no lady ought to need. Lord Pembroke, dining at his club that same week, heard the news with considerably less amusement than most. For languages, he repeated to his companion, swirling his glass slowly. How very inconvenient. He said nothing more on the matter that night. But the following morning, a letter went out under his seal, quiet, careful, addressed to no one Ashford would ever think to suspect, and the first small thread of sabotage began, unnoticed, to pull tight. By the following week, Lady Whitmore had become a fixture at the negotiation table, and Duke Ashford had begun to notice things about her that had nothing to do with languages at all, the careful way she chose her words even in English, the quiet steadiness in her hands when the envoys grew tense, the small, private smile she wore when a difficult phrase finally landed correctly. "You're staring, Your Grace," she said one afternoon, not looking up from the letter she was translating. "I'm observing. There's a difference." "Is there?" But she was smiling when she said it, and he found he did not mind being caught. Clara Hastings, watching from the library doorway with the particular satisfaction of a friend whose advice has finally been proven right, said little about it directly. She had spent 2 years urging Margaret Whitmore to stop hiding her gifts behind quiet cataloguing and modest silence. Now, watching her sit across from a duke as an equal in all but title, Clara allowed herself a small, knowing smile of her own. But not everyone in Bristol shared her satisfaction. The first sign of trouble came quietly. A shipment manifest, translated by Lady Whitmore days earlier, was suddenly disputed by the envoys, a clause they insisted had been altered from what she'd originally rendered. She was certain of her own work. She always checked twice. "I would never make such an error," she told Ashford, and he believed her. Then someone altered it after. The second sign came a week later, a servant who claimed to have overheard Lady Whitmore speaking disparagingly of the Duke's business sense to a rival house. It was a lie, transparent to anyone who knew her, but lies did not need to be believed to cause damage. They needed only to be repeated. "Someone is working against you," Clara said bluntly, when the two of them sat together that evening, the fire burning low. "Against both of you, perhaps. Who would benefit from Ashford's deal collapsing?" Clara considered. "Half the merchant lords in Bristol, I imagine. But only one who's mentioned your name rather too often at his club this month." Margaret said nothing, though the name settled uneasily in her mind. Lord Pembroke had always been civil to her, distantly, dismissively civil, the way men of his standing were civil to women they did not consider worth genuine attention. It seemed almost absurd that he would trouble himself over a librarian's daughter. And yet. That night, a note arrived at her lodgings, unsigned, written in a careful, deliberate hand. It made no threats outright. It did not need to. It spoke only of her late father, of debts he'd left unpaid, of reputation so easily tarnished, of how unfortunate it would be if certain old matters resurfaced now, just as she'd finally found herself somewhere worth standing. Margaret read it twice, her hands steady even as her chest tightened, and understood, with sudden clarity, that someone wanted her silent. She did not tell Ashford. Not at first. Instead, she continued exactly as before, precise, unshaken, present at every meeting, though Clara noticed the faint shadow behind her eyes and pressed her gently until the truth came out over tea the following morning. "Blackmail," Clara said flatly. "Over what, exactly? Your father was an honest man." "I don't know. That's what frightens me. Whoever wrote it implied there was something, some old debt, some scandal, but offered no proof. Only the threat that it could surface. Then it's likely nothing at all. A bluff, meant only to frighten you into silence." Clara set down her cup with more force than necessary. "Which means someone is very afraid of what you know." Margaret turned the thought over. Not what she knew about her father. What she knew about the negotiations themselves, the mistranslated manifest, the altered clause, the lie about her disparaging the Duke. Someone had gone to considerable trouble to discredit her, and blackmail was simply the next tool when discrediting failed. She thought of Lord Pembroke's careful civility. His questions, always phrased so casually, about how the negotiations progressed. His presence, more frequent than coincidence should allow, at gatherings where Ashford's business was discussed. That afternoon, she did something she had never permitted herself to do in another man's household. She looked. Not at documents that belonged to her, but at correspondence Ashford himself had received and dismissed as unimportant, shipping schedules, contract drafts, letters from rival houses he deemed harmless. Buried among them, she found a manifest bearing Pembroke's seal, dated the same week her translation had been disputed, referencing shipping terms suspiciously similar to the clause that had been altered. It was not proof. Not yet. But it was a thread, and threads, pulled carefully, unraveled. She brought it to Ashford that evening, laying it before him without preamble. "I believe Lord Pembroke has been working against you," she said. "Against us. He's paid off translators to abandon you, and now he's threatening me to keep silent about it." Ashford went very still. He read the manifest twice, his expression darkening with each line, and when he finally looked up, something in his face had changed entirely, not merely anger at Pembroke, but a dawning, uncomfortable recognition of how close he had come to losing everything, and how thoroughly he had underestimated the one person capable of saving him. "He threatened you," he said quietly. "It was not a question. He implied my father's reputation was vulnerable. I don't yet know to what. Then we find out. Together." He said it simply, without grandeur, and yet it landed with the full weight of a promise. That was the moment everything changed, not merely the negotiation, not merely the sabotage, but the quiet understanding between them that neither intended to face what came next alone. Margaret felt something loosen in her chest that had been tight for years, the particular relief of being believed, entirely, by someone whose good opinion she had not realized she wanted until now. Outside, the Bristol evening settled into darkness, and somewhere across the city, Lord Pembroke sat down to write another letter, unaware that his careful scheme had just begun to unravel. Ashford confronted Lord Pembroke 2 days later, though confronted understated the tension that filled the room the moment the two men stood face to face in Ashford's study. "You've made a serious accusation," Pembroke said, unruffled, swirling brandy he had not been offered. "I'd be careful, Ashford. Accusations without proof have a way of damaging the accuser rather more than the accused. I have a manifest bearing your seal. Manifests get copied. Seals get borrowed. You'll need considerably more than that before any magistrate takes you seriously." Pembroke's smile did not waver, but something behind his eyes tightened. "And I'd think carefully about dragging Lady Whitmore's name into a public dispute. Her father's affairs were complicated. I'd hate for old debts to resurface simply because she couldn't hold her tongue." The threat was unmistakable now, spoken plainly rather than hidden in an unsigned note, and Ashford felt fury rise in him with a force that surprised him, not merely on behalf of his ruined negotiations, but for her. "You threatened her. I made an observation. What she does with it is entirely her own affair." Ashford said nothing further, but the moment Pembroke left, he sent for Clara. "I need everything you and Margaret can find. Everything. If he's threatening her father's name, then he knows something we don't, or he's counting on us never looking closely enough to disprove it." Clara did not disappoint. Within 2 days, she and Margaret had traced the old debts Pembroke alluded to back to their source, a minor, decades-old dispute over a translation contract Margaret's father had completed honestly, which a dissatisfied client, connected, it turned out, to Pembroke's own family, had spread as rumor of dishonesty at the time, never proven, never retracted. It was nothing. It had always been nothing. Pembroke had simply known the rumor existed and gambled that Margaret, unfamiliar with the full history, would fear its resurfacing enough to stay silent. "He built a threat out of smoke," Margaret said, staring at the old correspondence Clara had unearthed, relief and anger warring in her chest in equal measure. "My father did nothing wrong. He never did." But the envoys, growing impatient with the delays and whispers surrounding the negotiation, had begun to lose patience regardless of the truth. Pembroke, sensing his blackmail had failed, shifted tactics entirely, approaching the envoys directly, offering them terms through his own house, insisting Ashford's negotiations had grown too compromised by scandal to trust. By the end of the week, the eldest envoy sent word, they were reconsidering the entire arrangement. Everything Ashford had built toward, everything Margaret had risked exposure to protect, stood on the verge of collapsing regardless of who was right and who was wrong. The envoys agreed to one final meeting before departing Bristol entirely, a courtesy, they said, though everyone in the room understood it as a formality before a polite refusal. Margaret arrived to find the atmosphere had shifted entirely. The envoys were courteous but distant, already half persuaded by whatever Pembroke had offered them in private conversation. Ashford looked, for the first time since she'd known him, genuinely uncertain, not of the terms, which he knew better than any man in Bristol, but of whether anything could still be salvaged. They believe the negotiation is tainted, he told her quietly, before the meeting began. Pembroke's told them I can't be trusted to manage my own affairs, that scandal follows this deal wherever it goes. I don't know how to undo that kind of doubt with words alone. Then don't undo it with words alone. Show them the truth instead. She had brought everything, the original manifest bearing Pembroke's seal, the correspondence proving her father's innocence, even the unsigned note that had first threatened her into silence, its handwriting matched carefully against a letter of Pembroke's that Clara had procured from a mutual acquaintance. When the meeting began, Margaret did not wait to be invited to speak. She laid the documents before the envoys herself, translating each one aloud in their own languages so there could be no confusion, no room for doubt or mistranslation to muddy the truth a second time. Lord Pembroke altered a manifest to disrupt this negotiation, she said, her voice steady despite the weight of every eye in the room. When that failed, he attempted to silence me with threats against a reputation that was never in question. I would rather lose this negotiation entirely than see it built on anyone's fear. For a long moment, no one spoke. The eldest envoy studied the documents carefully, then looked at Margaret with something that might have been respect. You risk much, he said, to defend a man's business that is not your own. I don't defend his business, Margaret said. I defend the truth. He simply happens to be standing on the right side of it. Ashford said nothing, but the look he gave her in that moment held more than gratitude, it held the quiet, dawning realization that whatever came of the negotiation, he had already found something far more valuable than any contract. The envoys withdrew to confer privately, and the silence that followed felt, to Margaret, longer than any she had ever endured. Every possibility crowded in at once: ruin, vindication, the collapse of everything Ashford had built, the public unraveling of her father's name regardless of the truth now laid bare. When the eldest envoy returned, his expression had softened considerably. We came to Bristol seeking a trading partner we could trust, he said. Lord Pembroke offered us terms. You, he inclined his head toward Margaret, offered us honesty, even at cost to yourself. We know which we value more. The agreement, they said, would proceed, under Ashford's house, and no other. Relief broke across Ashford's face, but his eyes found Margaret's first, before anyone else's, and in them she read something that had nothing at all to do with trade agreements. Lord Pembroke's schemes did not survive scrutiny once the envoy's testimony reached Bristol's Merchant Council. Within a month, his contracts dissolved, his reputation followed, and the city that once feared crossing him found little reason to defend him further. Duke Ashford's negotiation, meanwhile, became the talk of every drawing-room, though less for its terms than for the woman who'd saved it. Margaret Whitmore was no longer spoken of as an unremarkable spinster, but as the translator who had outwitted a lord and secured a duke's fortune with nothing but her mind and her honesty. Ashford proposed that autumn, in the library where she'd spent so many quiet years unnoticed. She said yes in 4 languages, just to watch him laugh. Society, for once, had nothing clever to say. What would you have done in her place?